I get it, you train hard, you're eating well, you're even dialing in your sleep, but you're still tired, you're sore, you feel like you're not making a lot of progress. Well, most people would put it down to overtraining, not doing enough mobility, or even taking the wrong supplements. Well, recent research shows the real reason why you're not recovering, and it might be related to your training intensity. And in today's video, I will break down a super cool study that really changed the way I think on the interaction between fatigue and recovery. And at the end of the video, I will even show you a fully fledged training plan that is based on the data of this study. So I think you will get a lot of value out of this video. All right, without further ado, let's go straight into it. Hi everyone, welcome to another video. I'm Gomar, I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich, and for the last decade or so I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology, and my goal now is to bring some of that science back to you guys. All right, first let's talk a little bit about recovery. Which parameters are involved in recovery? Because I think there are a lot of misconceptions around recovery and fatigue. I always look at it from three different aspects. The first aspect will be glycogen. Glycogen, if you have watched some of my earlier videos, is basically stored glucose, stored energy that is in the liver as well as in the muscles, right? It is required for high intensity exercise, for going hard, for example, during hyrox or CrossFit workouts or any other type of high intensity sports. And what we know is that the higher the intensity, the more or the faster the glycogen breaks down. So for example, you're doing a 6-minute AMRAP or Fran or something very hard in the CrossFit style workout, your glycogen will go down fast. That's a very typical effect of training. And then what we know for recovery is that the first hour after your training, after your session, there will be a rapid resynthesis of this glycogen. And then it takes up to 24, even 48 hours to fully restore your glycogen. And we know that the glycogen availability when you start exercise, for example, a hyrox race, certainly longer exercise bouts, is super important. Meaning that if you start already with a low glycogen level, for example, you didn't eat well, you didn't recover well, that will certainly affect your performance and overall your recovery. Good. So glycogen, very important parameter that is determining your recovery. Then another parameter that is related towards recovery, and I think is very familiar to a lot of people, is the soreness of the muscles, the DOMS, right? The delayed onset of muscle soreness. For example, yesterday I did deadlifts from the blocks into cyclist squats. So my glutes are pretty sore. Usually it takes up to 24 hours where you feel the maximum soreness, even 48 hours for some muscle groups, and then it fades away, but it can take up to 3, even 4 days before the soreness is fully gone. So that's certainly also, let's say, a parameter, an aspect of recovery that largely affect your performance. And this leads us towards the last, and I think the most important parameter of recovery. I always call this the end boss of recovery, and that is simply your performance. Usually scientists measure this by how high you can jump from standing still or your maximal voluntary contractions on a leg extension machine and so on. And obviously during or right after your training, when you do high intensity training, your performance, like how well your muscles can contract, will go down. And this also takes a certain time depending on the muscle group and how hard you trained to fully recover. So I would still say you can be sore and even your glycogen levels can be reduced, but your end recovery is predominantly determined by your performance. If your performance is back to 100%, you're likely, or I would say, you're fully recovered. All right. So that's basically a little bit of background on recovery and how you can think about recovery. The question of this video is, what is determining or what is driving your recovery? And then I found a very interesting paper that really changed my mindset about the whole philosophy. So you have here a paper from James Sprague and Jeroen Zwart from South Africa. I will put the link towards the paper in the description so you can have a deeper dive into the data. And the goal of this work was to understand whether the intensity of your training, not the total volume, but rather the intensity of the training has an effect on subsequent recovery. Bear with me because this is interesting. So they took 14 professional cyclists in South Africa. So they had a critical power, so an aerobic threshold of 5.4 watts per kilogram. That's very good, well-trained endurance athletes. And what did they do? The first phase, they did a power profile test. If you have never done this, something that you can also do at home is basically you do a 5-second sprint, all out for 5 seconds, and you record the watts. Then you do it 3 minutes after some rest. You do a 3-minute maximum all out effort. And then after a little bit more rest, 20-25 minutes, you do a 12-minute all out effort. And all the time you measure your watts. And this is usually how such a curve looks like. You obviously have very high power output in the short time domains, and then it exponentially goes down until it kind of flattens out, and that's where the aerobic system or your critical power is situated. All right, so that's very well known in endurance sports, and something that I think is sometimes overlooked in high intensity functional sports like CrossFit. It would be highly interesting to know it for yourself, how much your drop off is and how high and how low your maximal power as well as your aerobic power is good, and how training is actually affecting this just on the side. So that's what they did, let's say, in the fresh state on those 14 cyclists. What we then have, they went a bit further, and in the second phase, they did randomly or a fatiguing protocol that was at lower intensity. It was 70% of their critical power. So that is just a zone 2 or a little bit above, depending on the trainability of the athlete, around the zone 2 effort. And they did this for exactly 2000 kilojoules. So related towards calories, maybe you know that better, it is around 480 kilocalories that they burned, right, at a low intensity. That's the most important thing that you have to understand from this. And then on another day, 72 hours to be exactly, they did a high intensity interval, which was, if I see it correctly here, 5 times 8 minutes on, with always 8 minutes of recovery or easy cycling in between. And the interesting part is that they burned the exact same amount of calories. So they expended the same amount of work during both trials, the low intensity as well as the high intensity. The only difference between the trials was obviously the intensity, because they worked during the high intensity intervals at 105 to 110% of their critical power. So at the threshold or just above the threshold. So pretty high intensity work. That's also a typical interval that many of those cyclists do. All right. And then obviously 72 hours, that was the whole goal of the study. They did another, let's say, a post-fatigue power profile test. So the same test that what they did in the fresh state, but 72 hours after, or the low intensity fatiguing protocol or the high intensity fatiguing protocol. Good, so now we know how the whole study was set up. Let's look a little bit closer at the data. First, here is the 15-second data, the data on an all-out effort on a 15-second sprint, basically, right? And you can see on the gray bar, in the fresh state, they could produce around 900 to 920 watts for 15 seconds on average. So pretty decent values. I mean, if you let a CrossFitter do that, that would probably be higher. But then in the fatigue state after the low intensity, the LIC, there's a slight drop-off, not significantly, quite interesting, right? But the yellow bar, which is the fatigue state after the high intensity effort, 72 hours after the high intensity effort, there is a significant drop-off compared to the fresh state, but also towards the lower intensity state. So this means that the high intensity, the intensity of the training has a dramatic effect on your overall recovery, even though the total work that was performed during the training, the total volume, let's say, was the same. A similar picture, but to a lesser extent, is visible for the fatiguing protocol after 3 minutes and after 12 minutes. You see also here in the yellow bar that there is a drop-off, a significant but less drop-off compared to the fresh state, right? But these effects are less strong than the short durations. The 1 second I didn't show you, but also towards the 15 seconds. The same picture is visible here for the 12-minute fatiguing protocol, where you see that there's actually no drop-off. So it seems that specifically the high intensity, the very short, powerful movements are dramatically affected by previous high intensity efforts or training bouts. Pretty interesting, pretty cool stuff. And then the authors looked a little bit more close or deeper into the data. And what they found here was large intra-individual variation. So variation or differences between the riders. You see here on the left, for example, is a rider that is very fatigue resistant. There's not a lot of drop-off after the low intensity or even the high intensity efforts, even at short, powerful movements. But a second rider, for example, here shown in graph B, he significantly suffered from the high intensity effort. Certainly in his short duration, after the high intensity efforts, he has a massive drop off in power output at 15 seconds, 20 seconds. And then it gets better once the efforts become longer. And then you also have someone like the rider C, who basically suffers after both low intensity as well as high intensity effort. So that's also why training plans, certainly when you're working with elite athletes in any type of sport, there is a need for individualizing their training plan, because everyone is going to recover different from different intensities. Very interesting stuff. This reminded me of a paper that was done by Wim de Rave. And Wim de Rave is a Belgian professor from University of Ghent. He's actually a friend and colleague of mine. And he found out something very cool. Sorry to quickly take you out of the video, but I wanted to mention that we just launched our affiliate programming. If you are a box owner, a gym owner, someone who likes to train in affiliate, and you recognize that you're actually spending a lot of time programming all the workouts throughout the week, well, we have the perfect solution for you. Me, together with my team of coaches, have been working for months on crafting the perfect program for your gym. That includes a strength part or a skill part, classic affiliate programming, followed by a Metcon that is well structured related towards your strength part. Additionally, this will be 7 days a week. Additionally, we also have one team workout, one strength only day, and one hyrox style conditioning part. That was in my previous affiliate always the most popular option. If you're interested, check the link in the description. It is just live from this week, actually. What we also have, that's kind of the second part of the affiliate programming. If you want to have a more private, a more one-on-one affiliate program that is really individualized towards your affiliate for a little bit of a higher price, we will adapt the training according to what you want, how many rowers you have, how many barbells you have. You will have direct access to the coaches. You will have a call every week to better structure all the training. And I think that is an option that is not really out there and would save you a lot of time and a lot of headache to get you and to craft the best program. All right, let's go back to the video now. He invented, so to say, the muscle talent scan. And what is the muscle talent scan? It is a way of assessing muscle fiber typology, so which muscle fibers you have, the fast twitch as well as the slow twitch, which is the predominant fiber typology, without taking a muscle biopsy. Because you have to know, maybe also you saw this in previous videos, when you want to know your muscle fiber typology, if you are rather a fast twitch explosive athlete versus a slow twitch endurance athlete, you have to take, or 10 years ago, you had to take a muscle biopsy. And then in the lab, I also did it with myself, you then have to understand or measure the different myosin heavy chains. And then you know, okay, this guy is rather 60% type 2 fiber and 40% type 1 fiber, for example, right? So that's very tedious and not very feasible in well-trained athletes. I mean, they are not going to give away a piece of their muscle. I'm talking about a pretty invasive measurement. So what did they figure is, we know just from biochemistry that there's a specific molecule called carnosine that is highly expressed, or let's say even exclusively expressed in type 2 fibers, right? So if we can measure carnosine, we actually know the muscle fiber typology. This is a bit of a side quest, but important for this video. And with an MRI, basically a proton magnetic resonance spectroscopy, you can assess or estimate the amount of, or the relative amount of carnosine in a muscle. And they did this with several athlete cohorts. And in one of those studies, they overtrained a bunch of well-trained endurance athletes, runners in this case. So they overtrained, so they first had a week of easy, normal volume, and then they had them all doing way more volume that they're used to, that they're normally are doing. So they are in a way of not really overtraining, but rather overreaching. And then they want to know, okay, is this correlated to the muscle fiber typology? And indeed, if you look at the graph that is showing up on the screen right now, there is a negative correlation between the gastrocnemius carnosine Z-score, which is basically the more to the right, the higher the Z-score, the more relative type 2 fiber the athlete has, and the change in running time to exhaustion. So after every training period, they did a running test. I think it was a 5K all-out test. And obviously, when you are overreached or overtrained, your test will be less good, your performance, your recovery will be less good compared to a fresh state. And the ones who were the most overtrained or showed the most signs of fatigue related to performance actually had the highest muscle fiber type 2 typology. So they were the fast twitch muscle fibers. Good. So this means that if you are watching this video and you're rather a fast twitch athlete, you're very explosive, you are likely going to need more recovery, certainly from high intensity efforts, for example, a Metcon in CrossFit or a heavy deadlift session and so on. If you are rather an endurance athlete, you can handle that volume much better, and maybe you need a little bit less recovery. You will be able to come back the next day a bit earlier, certainly when you dial in the other parts of recovery. Obviously, it's not one-to-one, and these are only correlations, but I mean, many other studies have shown similar results. So if you are a trainer or an athlete, something definitely to keep in mind. Cool. This already brings us to the take-home message of this video that shows that, I mean, we have now some good data. I showed you one paper, but there's also other papers showing very close to the same thing, that the intense training bouts is what requires the most recovery. Even when the total work you're doing, the amount of calories or amount of work you're doing during that session is matched for low intensity. I think that's an important caveat. And this recovery is specifically related to high intensity efforts the next day or the next 2 days. So if you want to do something like plyometrics or weightlifting, that will be the most affected by your previous training. Zone 2 training or something lower intensity will be less affected, most likely. That also shows that I talked about this in previous videos, that if your goal is to accumulate a lot of training volume, so just hours of training, you have to train in the low intensity zones. That's also why the Norwegians and many of the endurance athletes train 70-80% of their training in low intensity, because they know, also from research and from own perceptions, that the recovery period for those exercise sessions is much lower. So they can come back the next day and go long, not hard, but go long again. And this, I think, is specifically interesting for hyrox athletes that I mean, if I see many of the training plans, I have to say that many people actually train too intense. It will only increase their recovery time, and maybe they cannot have the desired training adaptations over a long period of time. Any case, hyrox is predominantly an endurance sport, so you should accumulate as much volume as humanly possible without overtraining yourself, and you have to do that in the lower intensity efforts or lower intensity training. If you are rather a crossfitter and someone who does a lot of high intensity, powerful movements, just make sure that sometimes less is more, meaning that if you do 4 quality training sessions, like high quality with a lot of intensity, with a lot of powerful movements, strength and so on, maybe that's enough for you that week. You will need a lot of recovery from that session. And if you want to accumulate a bit more volume, maybe do some zone 2 training in your recovery days or your easy days, right? And then last part I would say is that this recovery period, or let's say the recovery after intense exercise, is predominantly, or at least for a large part, determined by your physique, your genetics, how many or the relative amount of fast twitch muscle fibers. If you're an explosive athlete, you probably need a little bit more recovery, specifically related to high intensity efforts such as weightlifting, high skill gymnastics, and so on. Good. I hope this helps you, and it helps you to restructure or structure your overall training plan. Maybe you're training a bit too much, too intense, and maybe you have to throttle it down and give you a little bit more breaks to have the long-term effects. Something to keep in mind. Just as a finisher, to show you how we implement some of these findings into our own training plans, this is an example training plan for hyrox, someone who wants to improve in the sport and wants to improve his overall endurance as well as his strength. So how does it work? We usually are switching between hard days and slow days to accumulate, as I said, the most volume as possible. For example, on Monday, they start with a zone 2 run, usually 40 to 50 minutes. Then the next day, they don't do any running, no high intensity movements. They just do compound lifts, right? To get stronger in the most important muscle regions, and certainly the lower body, such as deadlifts, front squats, and so on. On Wednesday, they have a rest day, because I think after those high intensity heavy efforts, you need a lot of rest also for the central nervous system to cool down and to have the training adaptations. On Thursday and Friday, they have a hard day. They have a speed day, a power day, usually CrossFit style workouts. And then on Friday, they have an interval run, 30-30 or 40-20, something interval-y that is close to your VO2 max, so hard, right? It will decrease your glycogen a lot. And then on Saturday, they have a little bit of a moderate day, or they can take a rest day, or they can do a zone 2 session in some of the training plans we have. Or when the athlete is already pretty advanced and can handle a lot of training volume, they do sleds as well as an easy run. So sled pull, sled push, superset, for example, and then an easy run in the afternoon. And then on Sunday, they do a hyrox specific interval style workout where they work for 40 minutes using all the functional movements. And then they repeat, obviously, the next week again. And then we undulate the training volume and the training intensity throughout time. If you're interested in those kind of training plans and how we see training, and also want to support the channel while also getting fit, just scan the QR code right now. There is a link that will show you all the different training plans we have related to hyrox as well as to functional fitness, CrossFit, and all based on the newest findings that we find interesting in literature. Cool. I really hope you got some value out of this video. If you did, please leave a quick like and also subscribe. I saw just the other day that 70% of all the people who watch these videos are not subscribed to the channel. I thought it was quite interesting. So please take a moment and click the subscribe button. If you're interested in how the timing of your carbohydrate intake affects your glycogen resynthesis and your overall recovery, as I just explained in this video, just click the video that is popping up right now. See you in the next one. Ciao.